Greetings! This video is starting off differently from my other reviews for two reasons. First, the sound quality is nowhere near what it should be. Without getting too much into specifics, something is going on with my video editor's codec that is diminishing the quality of my recordings. So I apologize for any headphone users as I tried my best to balance the audio for speakers. If you wish to hear what the original audio sounds like, you can visit the link in the description. I may simply post the unaltered audio there if nothing else works. Second, if you followed my channel for any amount of time, you probably are surprised that this video starts off with me talking rather than a dramatic introduction. That's because I had to talk over it instead. Rather than contesting any copyright claims for something that doesn't give me any ad revenue to begin with, I have a couple alternatives. If you wish to view the complete video, you can either play the trailer from the on-screen annotation over the first minute and 20 seconds, or you can simply watch the whole video from the Google Drive link down below. All I ask is that if you do watch or listen to the video elsewhere, please leave this video open so I can still earn any watch minutes. Thank you. As someone who has played every single Spiderweb software game within the last 3 months, okay, not every single entry, I am sane and mortal after all, but at least one game from each series. My greatest fear was of getting burned out by the 17th or the 25th entry. To my surprise, Queen's Wish was more refreshing of an experience than I ever expected, which wasn't simply due to the fact that I played it from the start on the veteran hard setting. Although the added difficulty did play a role in my appreciation for the many added touches to the same tried and true mechanics, what reinvigorated my fondness for Jeff Vogel's games was how much excess fat was taken off. While I wouldn't go as far as to declare that Queen's Wish is Vogel's best game or his greatest story, Queen's Wish is undoubtedly the best paced adventure he has ever made. Now, in most cases, my preferred choice of challenge as well as how many games are under my belt wouldn't be stated so bluntly in a review. Even if you are someone with no prior knowledge of a developer or his or her games, your opinions can be just as valid as my own if you substantiate your arguments as well as re-examine your own points from another perspective. The reason for highlighting these aspects is to help explain to fans as well as to newcomers why most of the new deviations aren't to the game's detriment. Once, and if, you get over the initial confusion about the many mechanics integral to Queen's Wish, you'll eventually realize that, while some elements could use some more polish, this game is not a case of dumbing down. It would be far more appropriate to call it streamlining old traditions. For anyone who doubts me, you can read Jeff Vogel's blog post illustrating the importance behind these alterations to the same Spiderweb song and dance. Spiderweb, Spiderweb, does whatever Jeff Vogel can. Spins a tale, maybe thrice. Dungeoneers just need a ply. Look out, here comes Miss Krazan. Or, you could just play the lengthy demo for yourself. However, we're getting ahead of ourselves, so let's go through this whole adventure from the beginning. Much like Abaddon, you aren't given any immediate customization to your character's archetype. You are given much more extensive cosmetic options, and I use the quotes here as a relative comparison if you have ever played these games. Unlike any other Spiderweb software game to date, there are no real classes as every character can become whatever he or she wants to be. Character stats do exist in some form as thresholds for the number of abilities you have in one specialty, which no longer makes upgrading feel like hoarding that one dumb stat from past games. Abilities are also unrestricted to weapon categories or armor classes, so if you desire to make a halberd-wielding sorcerer with plate armor, or a rogue with priest and mind-bending abilities, then you most certainly can. Although you are given various warrior-focused abilities from the get-go, you don't have to keep those skills, nor any skills you may accumulate. This departure is another major change as you are meant to constantly experiment with your party's composition, especially when you are given 4 Haven soldiers after the first main quest. You will also be heavily encouraged, but don't let Old Man Jeff or me stop you, to replace your 4 compatriots with your new vassals after you have acquired your first fortress in each new land. These 3 vassals have clan-specific abilities much like the protagonist with no class restrictions, but the vassals' abilities are geared for specific playstyles. The Haven soldiers apparently don't have time to become as cultured as you. When I asked Jeff about this problem, he told me it was intentional that the soldiers were meant to be disposed as quickly as possible. Although if you are an RPG veteran as myself, you probably have sentimental attachment to whatever heroes you get at the start. So I think it would be better in future games if you were forced to remove them entirely. This system, while I will always vastly prefer my CRPG parties with 6 focus adventurers, rather than accepting the boring 4-man archetypes, does address the inherent problems with many modern RPGs by heavily incentivizing and rewarding diverse hybrid classes with as few limitations as possible. Another important mix-up from previous games, which is also tied into the player's progression, is the addition of the fortress building mechanics. This system, depending on how much and when you utilize the full extent of these features, can either become the most superfluous or the most beneficial addition to your party. These fortresses not only provide you more resources the more side quests you complete in a given area, but also are the home for your upgradable gear, potions, armor, and weapon components, as well as provide you other useful combat benefits. Some of these buildings require specific resources available in each region, and there is a maintenance budget to keep you from getting everything all at once. Now, the way I view it, instead of viewing these mechanics as being something separate from the player, it would be far more useful to think of them as another extension of the player's progression, as these forts give you better odds of survival rather than having the player focus solely on an arbitrary number of his or her own level. Now, if all these changes to the player's progression were simply isolated from the core gameplay, then it would be hardly worth all the extra effort. These features haven't changed anything that didn't already exist in other games. You might reasonably argue that this process complicates something as simple as choosing 4 classes or 4 custom classes and rolling with the punches. However, it's how these changes work with the improvements to dungeoneering that tells the real story. Dungeons, as well as combat encounters, have always played a prominent role in previous games, so it's not surprising that these changes have also been the most controversial. For starters, while random encounters on the overmap still exist, these encounters nor the dungeon's trash mobs, that's Jeff's classification, not mine, give you any XP. Instead, the only way you gain XP is by slaying bosses or by completing quests, which are far greater incentives to go off the beaten path for a side quest rather than grinding weaker foes. Now, if you're concerned that makes the game more linear, then I will sadly tell you no. I went into many areas way underleveled and undergeared, and I was able to overcome most threats until the very late endgame, which then I had many other ways to improve my chances. Perhaps this one addition alone is why so many dungeons for side quests often yield far more entertaining encounters, such as the encroaching lava in the Quicksilver mine while fighting off dozens of slimes. Additionally, side quests also provide you resources for the forts that you can use to improve your gear, so you rarely have to stop your adventures in order to go find somewhere to level up or to obtain more rare ingredients in some obscure place. The second major change is that whenever you leave the dungeon, you will have most, not all, enemies respawn on your next visit. This mechanic also works with the vitality or energy system from Avedon, where spells and abilities are spammed less often in favor of more tactical gameplay, but you do earn some energy back for every kill after the battle ends. However, some method to generate energy mid-battle would help alleviate the obvious drawbacks of this system. The only way to completely clear an area is when you have killed the dungeon's boss. Certain special encounters like scripted ambushes appear to be exceptions, which can make any return trips much easier after you have better prepared yourself. Even if you leave, all the items you have obtained will stay with you, as there are no more junk items nor an endless pile of worthless daggers to pawn off. With the additional mechanic that all your potions will be refilled whenever you visit your forts, the penalty of failure isn't as severe as past games. In fact, even if you perish, your misfortune may yield far more profitable results than you might expect. The final major alteration to Queen's Wish is the fact that you cannot die, or it would be more proper to describe the mechanic as a magical prevention to your final death. Instead of having to reload a quick save to try again, you will be sent back to Fort Haven with a day's progress gone, where you can buy equipment, change your loadout, or be stubborn enough to try again completely refreshed. Sometimes this mechanic can be extremely beneficial, such as when I had killed the boss while his henchmen finished me off, which made my return trip to loot the place much easier when they were all gone. Now, if this happens to you and you don't want a cheap victory, you could always reload your last save. Or you could use this exploit in your favor if a particular boss gives you too much trouble. The point behind this mechanic is that it gives you another means of victory when in danger, even if that results in a small defeat, as well as taking away any downtime between exiting the dungeon and returning to your fortress to try again. Much like many other revisions to the same formula, these changes, once you learn to accept them and understand how they work off one another to the player's benefit, ultimately make the game a far richer experience. Quite honestly, outside of that one exploit, I don't understand why anyone wouldn't appreciate these obvious improvements. Any sentiments in favor of adding more trash mobs, XP grinding, or meaningless loot feels misguided by adhering to tradition rather than accepting the benefits of innovation. Something that I wish the rest of Queen's Wish would more often adhere to. Having watched, read, and followed Jeff Vogel for some time, innovation isn't a foreign concept no matter how often his games are criticized for being more of the same. If anything, Queen's Wish feels like a direct response to those 25 years of criticisms by changing up the visuals as well as the overall gameplay. That being said, sometimes innovation also carries with it an increased risk of failure, which has to be managed with respect to budget, time, and expected sales. So any criticisms that I may have should be considered against the business realities of the situation. However, as one of the billions of other people on the internet with an opinion, I'm still going to complain. As someone more focused on mechanics and narrative in reviews, I do feel the need to start off by pointing out similar past problems that don't bother me as much, as well as more personal nitpicks. While there was a Kickstarter stretch goal to improve the sound quality, the milestone wasn't reached, so the sound effects are pretty much identical to the ones found in Avernum 1. The old one, but not Exile. There is also no in-game soundtrack, so you'll need a mixtape or a YouTube playlist on hand if you want something more than ambient sounds. Perhaps in the future, I'll make a mixtape for every Spiderweb software game that I complete. Anyway, what is perhaps the most confusing aspect of the presentation, at least for Spiderweb software fans, is the regression from the isometric perspective back to the Exile top-down view. After a couple of hours, the visuals grew on me despite how odd some of the proportions were, as doors appeared to be made for giants, as well as the fact that some of the upward stairs looked like walls. As far as what this perspective does for the gameplay, the only difference it adds is that some of the bigger enemies now occupy more than one tile, which can be used in combat for your benefit. Outside of those minor problems, although I understand if those aspects bother you more than I, my bigger problems with Queen's Wish concerns its narrative-related issues, which may be excused as of right now by how much effort was put into prioritizing the many gameplay enhancements. These narrative matters are divided between breaks in immersion as well as unresolved plot threads. One category is going to be more important to the developer than the other because we are talking about games, but it's still important to consider both because some examples may overlap with one another. Additionally, these unresolved threads may be answered in future entries, either as intended or as a way to address the previous games. So if anything, I am giving the developer free consultation for future stories. Immersion is one of those finicky magic tricks where the more sleight of hand you apply, the harder it is to maintain the illusion. But is it equally a problem when a game feels too much like a game? The whimsical funny shape of Sacramentum is something that I can't accept because it's fantasy, although I'm still going to point this out. What is this map? Am I playing Rage 2 with my wing stick? Meanwhile, the various contrasting climates being connected to one another as one landmass can often feel like a level select screen following the video game rule of 3. Quite honestly, if these regions were segmented into individual islands, then I don't think the thought would have occurred to me. But I understand the inclusion of a boat would also pose various narrative problems of its own. For a counterexample to these problems, what interested me the most about Avernum was how much attention to detail there was in the writing and the environments to make the locations seem so lifelike, from the green cows and mushroom farms to the various faction wars uniting against an empire from the underworld. You know, out of context, this example does sound equally silly. This criticism isn't to say that each area in Queen's Wish lacks attention to detail, because when you do consider these areas separately, you do see an equal amount of care, especially in the maps themselves, or how the environments affect their respective cultures. You can see this from the value of pride for the Vols and their disgrace for creating debts to one another in a harsh land where stealing another man's steed is akin to murder, or how the deadly swamplands have created people all too quick to action at the smallest offense, and how these attitudes foster an overwhelming sense of self-loathing. While the land itself may not convince me this place is real, the people and their hardships do make this place feel believable. This one aspect alone, along with the many other examples of this game's world building, is what makes the overall story of Queen's Wish so enticing, despite those moments where the facade gives away. So why then do I have a harder time with one game versus another? Quite simply, the beginning. Now, having gone back to play Avernum as well as Abaddon, I can more definitively say that Queen's Wish may have the weakest and the most confusing start of any spiderweb game. And it's also indicative of many other examples where the contrivance of the plot gets in the narrative's way. Without going too much into detail, you are the thirdborn of a queen who wishes to resolve one of her 3 greatest regrets of losing her hold on Sacramentum, so you are sent in with no previous experience in war or conquest, alone. In addition, the speedy introduction of the protagonist's family as well as the history of Haven is over so quickly, which is fine because you do get a better understanding from all the people of Sacramentum what the Havenites are like. But you never really get a chance to see the real might of Haven, much like the Black Fortress in Abaddon. Probably because Jeff is still thinking it up. For an example outside of these games, one could look at the introduction for Tyranny. In that game, you are one of many trained ambassadors sent in for the will of Kairos, and your goal is to conquer the last remaining lands for your emperor. The introduction not only gives you a better idea of the stakes of the adventure, but you also understand the absolute might of Kairos. This type of introduction is very similar to Queen's Wish, but there is far more leeway for the player to either serve the will of Kairos in their own way, or to pursue their own ambitions, which sets up a far better introduction than what we have here in Queen's Wish. Now, Avernum pulled off something similar, as the Empire was always alluded to by other characters, but the execution there worked with the underdog narrative. Having an authority figure appear inept doesn't really excuse the fact that they appear incompetent. Even when you do get 300 soldiers per region, those soldiers will not accompany you until you have effectively conquered the land all on your own. The rationale that you're given at the beginning is that the Queen wants to see if you are worthy after all the training you have had in isolation. You might as well say that the game designer didn't want to make the game that short. Finally, the whole power to avoid your death is never really properly explained other than some magical wards. Nor does any of the characters ever recognize you dying in battle or even simply vanishing. Unlike all the other spiderweb games, these sort of problems just don't exist. In Avernum, you were simply a band of adventurers sent to exile. In Geneforge, you were an apprentice sent on a trial who was shipwrecked. In Abaddon, you were a newfound apprentice for the Pact after properly meeting them and being tested by their trials as the tutorial. Neither game expected you to overcome some great obstacle, which is why each journey feels like an act of heroism. Even when you were sent in alone, such as hunting down the leader of the Sliths in Avernum, there was a more reasonable explanation that you wouldn't be noticed, or traced back to a certain faction as mercenaries. You were also never given any abilities without being told the context behind them, such as the Shaper's magic at the start of Geneforge. While the introduction doesn't do a good job explaining this, there are reasons later on that offer better explanations. For example, when you head into the Vol territory, there is a civil war raging on between the Owens and the Masha, and your presence there could escalate matters if you were sent in with a full army. For the Swamplands, the Ucat are divided amongst themselves, which poses greater risk to your soldiers if they were separated. For the Aerial, their forests often have a mind of their own, which may trap your soldiers or physically harm them if they anger the Mad Wizards. All these explanations are somewhere within the game, but I don't think the story gives enough emphasis on that front as to why you are sent in alone when all your soldiers are hanging back letting you do all the dirty work. The only instance that ever brings this topic up is when you are sent in to re-establish the peace treaty from your mother, which would also go to explain why you are sent in her place because you are the most royal blood available. Now, as much flack as I have given the introduction, there is a silver lining here because the ending and everything leading up to it almost gets everything right, even when the line of what really happened gets equally confusing as the start. While most of the choices that affect the ending happen towards the end of each region's arc, the stories leading up to that moment as well as the many side quests provide narrative, sometimes even gameplay rewards. Even in the final dungeon, there are almost half a dozen different outcomes structured like Pathfinder Kingmaker's epilogue that will influence how the ending plays out, which gets more and more difficult from those succeeding encounters. I would also like to add that the entire final act does pose some gameplay balancing issues if you thought armor tiers had a light, medium, and heavy rating system. But having gone back to finish Avernum, I don't think these balancing issues are anything new. Even when I turned the difficulty down to normal, the final encounters still kicked my ass, so I had to resort to playing it on casual mode in order to get this footage. Anyway, excusing those gameplay balancing issues, while I wouldn't go as far as to declare the quests here to be as complex as Geneforge, these quests do a much better job than most quests in Avedon to give the player as many choices as possible, and make them mean something. Although the scarcity of these more impactful quests varies with each region, as well as the number of choices per quest, the result feels like a game all too often stretched too thin at every opportunity. As previously mentioned, some oversights can be explained by constraints, budget, or business habits, and I find this last problem the result of having to always make an indie RPG for 50 plus hours with 100 plus quests because it has become his tradition at this point. Choosing business over creativity has been the name of the game for Jeff Vogel for 2 decades, and I won't fault him for doing what he does best if he believes that much is worth the asking price of $20, or $15 on a bad day if the coin lands on heads. While there wasn't any place to mention this information beforehand, the hint book and game bundle is a good example where what is best for the product and consumer, as well as what is best for the business, can make a good compromise. Although some vague puzzles like the aerial thicket seem a little obtuse without the map reference, but this section is supposed to have positive vibes. P.S. You could sweeten the deal if you package some of those original graph papers with developer notes rather than feed them to the dog. I guess what I'm trying to get across is that we could always ask what if to these kinds of situations. What if the game was 30 to 35 hours and 70 quests with an equal amount of choices per quest and a greater focus on replayability? Or we can appreciate what we have at the moment. Flaws, crappy graphics, and wonderful bits of writing in all.